Well, I want to welcome everyone tonight who's tuned in for tonight's webcast from the Objector Church. My name is James Branham, and I'm one of the ministers of the Objector Church. I'm based out of Oklahoma City. And tonight I'll be sharing, we may, by the way, have a special guest join us tonight. We may or may not, may be delayed for a future week. But if we do, that'll be an exciting development. But otherwise, you're stuck with me. And in our weekly webcast, we seek to do three things. We seek to bring about a little bit of information, empowering information that helps us to do good in the world. We also talk about information that is actionable information that we can, I got those twisted around. Inspiration is giving us the energy, the drive, the love that we need to keep moving forward in our lives. Information is that actionable information that we can use in our lives, either individually or collectively, to make things better. And finally, a bit of interaction. So tonight, our conversation is going to be about something really critically important, and that is discussing the issue of the draft, what's also sometimes known as military conscription. And that really is going to, truthfully, that's going to be a mostly information part. The inspiration will be, we have a little ritual to do at the beginning. And finally, along the way, we want to have a widely varying conversation. So anyway, to go ahead and get started, we'll do our little bit of a ritual. And what I do for the ritual each week, and we're a religious humanist community, meaning that we don't really identify as a community with a particular tradition. Some of us do belong to traditions, specific traditions. Some of us don't. Some of our members are atheists and agnostics. But our point of unity is our collective belief in the power of humanity to change things. And we look to those issues that religious people do, issues of identity, meaning, value, ethics. So that's why we are religious humanists. But a lot of us still yearn, even if we may not always identify with all of the aspects of the symbols and rituals of our previous traditions, or those we still carry with us, a lot of us still yearn for some sense of a ritual. So that's why we do this candle lighting ceremony. And tonight I'm doing something slightly different than previous weeks. Tonight we'll just be lighting the candles, taking a moment to take some deep breaths as we go through this process. And what I'm envisioning these candles, what they represent tonight, is the idea of the past, of everything that's brought us to this point, the idea of the present, which is our moment when we can do something to change what's to come for the future. And so we'll light these candles, take a moment to reflect and be in this moment, then we'll move into our conversations. So as you light this first candle representing the past, we think about those things that have gone before, the good things, the bad things, everything along the way. We light the candle for the present, for this moment, and thinking about our intentions to make our lives better, to make the world better. And finally, the candle for the future, to represent the hope that we have that maybe our efforts will do something, and that always people have looked for hope in the midst of darkness, and that nothing is really completely dark as long as someone is hoping a little bit. So anyway, those are the candles we've lit for our ritual tonight. So now I want to move into our conversation. We do have someone that may join us later on. We've had some problems, mostly on my end, on communications with our guests. So we may or may not have him tonight. Hoping we do, we'll see. But if he does join us, actually, I'm getting a message here. I think he is joining us. Okay, very exciting news. Our guest will be joining us tonight, hopefully in just a moment. So I'm going to wait a second for him. In the meantime, though, I want to say that if anyone is watching on Facebook, we do welcome your comments along the way. Be periodically looking at Facebook Live as the webcast is going on. So if you have comments and questions, please post them. And by the way, Serena, I don't know if she knows, I guess, who our special guest is for tonight. His name is Ed Hasbrouck. He is a longtime draft activist, but he's also someone who's paid the price for resisting the draft. And so looking forward to having him on to talk about some of these issues, but talk just for a moment about his history as well. So let me go back over to Zoom, though, see if Ed is over here yet. Okay, Ed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, fantastic. I can hear you now, Nat. Hear you now. Fantastic. Well, it is such an honor to have you on tonight. When Jeff had mentioned you for this, I was really excited. So, anyway, just want to thank you so much for being here this evening. And I know some of our guests know who you are, some of you don't. So I thought we might start by just for a moment of talking a little bit about your history on this issue for a few minutes. And then, if you'd like, I'd like to have a conversation about what do our viewers need to know about where draft law is currently and where it's moving, because there's some pretty challenging developments. So, Ed, maybe get us started. Could you share a little bit about who you are and what has brought you to this area of work?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me in. Hopefully we'll have some time to take questions if there are questions, because I think some of the news that's come out in the last week has been really badly misreported, even by some of the journalists who ought to know better, and in fairly mainstream media, and in other places even more distorted interpretations. So I got involved with the issue of the draft back in 1980 when I was there had been as you may know, and some of our listeners, older ones may know, there had been a hiatus where actually ended draft registration for 5 years, from 1970 to 1975, rather, to 1980, after the Vietnam War. And we really thought that the draft was dead. Selective service system was in deep standby. They weren't actually doing anything. But in 1980, I was in the first group of people who was required to register when they started up the system of selective service registration, which continues today.
How old
And
were you then?
I was 20 years old. Now you have to register as you turn 18. But when they started the system up after this 5-year gap, they tried to jumpstart it by registering people up to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. They had mass registration weeks for everybody born in 1960 was supposed to go down during the post office during one particular week, which ended up being really a godsend to draft counseling organizations, which were able to post people at the post offices. There were a lot of demonstrations. It was very highly visible, and it served to call attention to the degree of support that people who didn't want to be drafted had. So it really backfired in many ways for the government. I was one of those who spoke out and organized, said that I wasn't going to register, and organized others to do likewise. And to make a somewhat long story short, although we can come back to this more if people are interested, and I know did a podcast about this a while back that's still up on Courage to Resist, the government faced with much more widespread resistance than it had anticipated. During those first mass weeks, there were 4 million people who were supposed to register and 1 million didn't, which really was beyond the scale of any level of resistance that we'd seen in the past, or that even those of us who were activists and organizers had hoped for. So faced with that situation, the government ultimately decided they didn't really have anything else they could do except to try to go after some of the organizers. And their theory was if they went after the most vocal non-registrants, that would have the most intimidating effect. It didn't. Again, it backfired for the government. I was one of 20 people who they picked out as the people they thought were the most visible activist organizers. I was prosecuted actually by Robert Mueller, the infamous one. I was
Really?
It was his first high-profile case, and the first case that got his political ambitions noticed. That's another story. He was then a junior assistant U.S. attorney in Boston. He was a Marine combat veteran. And there's actually, well, let me tell you, there's a real contrast between he has a lot in common in background with John Kerry. They both were Ivy League college graduates who volunteered for Vietnam, went in, Mueller was a colonel in the Marines in combat in Vietnam. But whereas John Kerry came back and joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War and became an activist against the war, Mueller was the kind of person who could go through that and come back from the war still believing in the legitimacy of the Vietnam War, still believing in the legitimacy of the draft that had sent the men who had fought and died under his command. And whether, he was really eager to go after draft resistors in 1980 when he had the chance. So anyway, there was a handful of activists who were prosecuted, but what it served to do was to call attention to the fact was that only those who had spoken out, like me, could be prosecuted. They had to use our own public statements in order to be able to convict us. And registration went downhill from there. So we've had a situation for the last 35 years where the Department of Justice abandoned prosecuting non-registrants in 1988 as a failure, even though Selective Service wanted them to carry on and go after more people. And they said, this is a waste of time. It's not going to work. They'd abandoned enforcement, but the law has remained on the books, and there are a wide range of other sort of administrative collateral consequences and sanctions. The one that's probably most obvious is ineligibility for federal student aid and federal jobs. The one that's actually the most severe penalty is that if you lived in the US, even as an undocumented immigrant, during the years when you were supposed to register from ages 18 to 26, and you later seek naturalization as a US citizen, you're ineligible. That's the big one. So there still are these other, side penalties, even though nobody is being prosecuted criminally. So that's, kind of where I came along. And I was involved throughout the 1980s with the draft resistance movement, which was active then. Since then, it's been, if people don't want to register, they don't register, and they may face some financial consequences, or again for immigrants, some immigration consequences. But there hasn't really been an organized movement for many years against the draft. That may begin to change now with recent developments.
Well, I think that brings us to some of the recent developments, and I wanted to share with you just a little bit so you to know a little bit about our community. This is a group that we have, our foundation is a religious humanist perspective that's focused on peace, but we have a lot of people that join our webcast who are parents. We have some young adults, people from a variety of different traditions, but are asking questions. And I'll share one more practical example. I had a conversation recently with a mother whose son was turning 18, and she was a first generation immigrant. Her son is a US citizen, but she was very confused. She thought she had to enlist her son at 18, which was terrifying to me. And I explained to her, no, that is not the case. Let's have a longer conversation. And so anyway, I just wanted to share with you that we have folks who are coming at this from a variety of perspectives. But I think for a lot of members of the public, what they're hearing is confusing because they've thought, one, the draft is kind of out there and is never going to happen. But secondly, these latest changes are threatening to a lot of people. So I wonder if you could maybe share with us where things are at and where they're going and what should people do with this information?
Well, in terms of what you last said, the draft remains a real possibility. The reason that people are required to register is not, this is not signing up for the government's birthday club. This is the only use for this database is a database that would be used in the event of a draft. And, it's the military says we don't really want to draft, and that's probably true. It's it's not Plan A, that's the active duty forces. It's not Plan B, that's the reserves. It's not Plan C, that's the National Guard. It's not even Plan D, is probably using allies and proxy war, and maybe Plan E is using civilian contractors, mercenaries. It's somewhere down around Plan F for fallback is the draft. But it's still in the military toolkit. It's something that they still feel like the ultimate recourse is if they need more cannon fodder and if the war becomes unpopular, well, they can always turn to a draft. They're reluctant to do it, but they still believe that there's this bottomless reserve force at the end of the day. They have not begun to constrain their military policy on the basis of thinking, well, we only have so many soldiers to play with. So it is both a real threat and something that influences military policy. I think there's an assumption that people who are opposed to the draft are trying to just get ourselves out of the war. Look, if I just wanted to get out of the war, I would have kept my mouth shut and I would have never gone to prison. So, the reason that we've been active in opposing this and the goal, and the reason it's not enough of a success that we've, stopped enforcement of draft registration. The goal is to rein in military adventurism, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
preventing a draft. So that said, where do things stand now? We've been in this kind of stalemate where draft registration was an abject failure, but there was no face-saving way for the government to repeal the registration requirement without admitting failure. And the government doesn't do well at admitting failure in war or
Mm-hmm.
politics or anything else, much less admitting that the power to wage war is actually directly constrained by people's willingness to wage war. That's a profound statement. It's
Absolutely.
not one Congress wants to make. So we've been in this situation of stalemate. But meanwhile, there were some other changes. Back in 1980, when Jimmy Carter proposed draft registration to Congress, he actually proposed a system that would have included both women and men. And Congress said no, and that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a challenge to registering men, and the Supreme Court at that time said, well, since they only want men for combat, there's a rational relationship between registering only men for the draft and only wanting men to be drafted for combat. So it's related to a military purpose, and as far as that military purpose, we'll defer to the military.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 4 years ago, the policy change was made to open all military occupational specialties to women, including combat assignments, without regard for gender, assuming that people are otherwise qualified. It immediately became a foregone conclusion that rationale of the 1981 Supreme Court decision no longer held up because the facts were no longer the same. There no longer is a military policy that we only want men for combat. And so there's no longer any rational relationship to registering only men.
Mm-hmm.
It was immediately obvious at that point that it was only a matter of time before the courts were going to find that the current registration system is unconstitutional. And that's what happened last week. Federal District Court in Houston, acting on a lawsuit that had actually been pending for a number of years and bounced around. But the court issued a declaratory judgment that the current draft registration system is unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's been widely misreported as saying that women have to register for the draft. It's not. The courts can't create new crimes and say, all of a sudden it's going to crime for women not to register. All they could do is look at the current law, which says men have to register, and say that's unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did. So it has no direct effect on women, and there's no way that any court could order that women register. There wouldn't be a registration requirement unless, in order to try to salvage registration and resurrect it basically after this ruling that it's unconstitutional, Congress passes a new law applying to women. So for now, this is a tremendous victory, but a partial victory. If unless Congress does something, the initial ruling was only what's called a declaratory judgment. So it, I think, was intended to give Congress a chance to sort this out in an orderly way. But if Congress doesn't do anything, the courts are going to move forward and they're going to enjoin selective service from continuing to register people, and draft registration is dead. Hooray. But all of those collateral consequences remain in place. So people who didn't register will, for the rest of their lives, still be ineligible for these various government programs. So it's a mess. And it's not just federal programs, but there are dozens of states that have enacted their own laws placing restrictions on people who haven't registered for the draft. And those will continue in place. This court ruling does nothing about that. So we'll have a real mess.
Oh, go ahead. One of the challenges I will mention, and I know you're aware of this, but I want to mention for our viewers, we have quite a few in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is one of many states that's pretty zealous in capturing a selective service registration without the applicant even knowing it. I've learned this, that, for instance, you apply for a driver's license, no one reads the fine print, or very few do. If you read the fine print, it says, if you're not already registered, we will register you. When you apply for any college in Oklahoma, there's a similar line. And they word it in such a way that unless you object and refuse to get the license or go to school, you're going to be registered by us. And so I think that's a fundamental change. And frankly, I think it's such a change from the dynamic of what Ed faced back in the day, where that there truly was a voluntary, you must fill out a form. Today, so many people who do not want to fill out the form, decline to fill out the form, will still have a form filled out for them. So.
Yeah. That is true. It's important to realize, and getting those state laws has been a long-term lobbying project, state by state, by Selective Service, and a very high priority. And once the Department of Justice said we're not going to prosecute anybody, this became one of the highest priorities for the Selective Service system, was getting these state laws. It's important to realize that that's not everywhere. There are some really major exceptions. The obvious and biggest one is that in California, where there are state constitutional restrictions on the use of driver's license data and a very strong state constitutional privacy protection, it probably couldn't be done through state law. And in any case, the state legislature has repeatedly declined to enact such a law. So the biggest state in the union, where I live, California, there's still no linkage, so you can get a driver's license without being registered for the draft. And that's true in a number of other states. Massachusetts, where I happen to be at the moment visiting family, is in that list too. So it's not everywhere, but you're right. And the Selective Service even has said, most of the people who are registered probably don't even realize that they're registered. There's other requirements on top of that there's even less awareness of, which I think affect whether draft registration even could be used. Not that I want it to be. People are supposed to tell the Selective Service system every time they move until they reach age 26. Nobody knows this is true, and nobody does it. I mean, I encourage you, go out in the street and ask people, any of our listeners, raise your hand if you ever reported a change of address to the Selective Service system.
Now, Ed, I will have to mention, I am one of the few who did, partially because I'm a big nerd, but secondly, about the time as I was in my mid-20s, I was moving in more of a conscious objector direction. After a long time of being a very rabid warmonger, I had switched my views pretty dramatically. And so I had read, someone gave the idea of taking your change of address form, and in the big spot that says, do not write here, you write in there in tiny letters, I'm a conscious objector, yada, yada, yada. And so I photocopied it, kept it in my file, and mailed it off. So, but I suspect those may be the only change of address forms the Selective Service gets, or people doing things.
That could well be. There hasn't been an audit since just a few years after the registration system started, but even within a couple of years, when the GAO audited the database, they found 20 to 40% of the addresses were already out of date. And now it's likely that if they actually tried to use that database, given how mobile people are, the majority of the induction letters would either wind up in the dead letter office, or they'd go to people's parents, and people's parents in many cases would tear them up rather than tell their son they're supposed to be drafted. And sure, tearing up the induction notice is a crime on the part of the parents, but many parents would quite willingly take that risk to protect their sons against being drafted.
Absolutely. Now, I wonder, though, as a practical necessity, and it may not be legal under current law for them to do this, but I've wondered, the Selective Service gives them a list of the people, completely inaccurate addresses and completely inaccurate contact information. Would the government simply cross-match those with commercially available databases? To me, I even wonder, why do you need the registration itself? Surely through commercial databases, they could have everyone snatched up that way.
The reasons that the military gives for continuing to support Selective Service registration, and we know, moving ahead a little bit, one of the things that's been going on, to back up a little bit, once it became clear that the current system was going to be found unconstitutional, there was a choice. Either we've got to end draft registration, either we sit back and do nothing and the courts will end draft registration, or we end it in some orderly way through legislation to repeal it, and maybe repeal some of these other collateral consequences, or we try to double down on these decades of failure by expanding draft registration to include women as well as men. And back in 2016, there was an extensive congressional debate about this. Ultimately, they decided to punt the issue into the next administration by, what do you do when you don't want to decide? You appoint a committee. So they appointed a National Commission on Military Service to study the question, which has been at work for the last 2 years. I'm going to be testifying at hearings that they're holding in April in Washington. They're holding 2 days of hearings on the future of Selective Service, including whether draft registration should be ended or should be extended to women. And in the course of that study by the commission, they've been pretty secretive, but I've been filing Freedom of Information Act requests and have gotten a bunch of information. So we do have the reports made by the Selective Service and by the Pentagon. The reason the Pentagon says it supports continuing draft registration, even though they don't want to draft, and they want to say, well, we're getting enough volunteers, the all-volunteer army is working just fine. But the reason they say they want registration is not so much that it would actually serve a draft, as that it serves to socialize people to the idea, the normativeness of military service, and it gives us an additional database that we can use for military recruiting purposes.
Aha. That makes a lot of sense. And that, to me, what's notable about that is that whether they ever get around to a draft at some point, it's still going to have a destructive role in society, this registration process.
Well, I think it very much does. You know, the idea is more of a gesture of subservience, a statement, you know, for someone like me or perhaps you, a false statement that we're willing to kill and die in any war that we're called up for. Since obviously the reason for a draft is per se to fight a draft that not enough people are volunteering for. You wouldn't need the draft. And, you know, without getting too far into the question of conscientious objection, you know, to fit the government's definition, you have to object to the right degree for the right reasons at the right time. You can't object too early or too late or to too great a degree or too lesser a degree. You have to object to all wars. Can't pick and choose your wars, even though most people would say there's some wars I'd fight and some wars I wouldn't fight. Most people are pacifists. You can't say, I don't want to have anything to do with the system. I think it's a militarist system. Well, no, that's too soon. On the other hand, if you wait, even though you can, in theory, be discharged as a conscientious objector, people will say, well, you shouldn't have waited till you got to the battlefield. But the reality is everybody draws the line at different places. You know, some people it is, I won't put on a uniform. Some people it's, I won't pick up a gun. Some people it's, I won't shoot at a human-eyed target. Some people it's, I won't shoot at an actual human. Some people it's, I won't shoot at children. Some people it's, I won't commit atrocities and war crimes. I mean, basically everybody but a sociopath draws the line somewhere. So really, unless you're a sociopath who's willing to kill absolutely anybody the government might imagine, you know, at some level, you have some level of objection, and you should be questioning whether you should sign a blank check which says, I'll fight any war anywhere against anyone on any terms as ordered, which is what you're doing when you sign a registration form.
Absolutely.
But of course, the government doesn't see it in those terms. But now we face, you know, a real debate where Congress can no longer put off this decision, and I think we're both going to see a recommendation from this National Commission, which may or may not be heeded, but the Commission's process is a public forum where we're getting a chance to debate this and hearings that, you know, we haven't had for decades about whether we actually should continue to have a draft registration program and why we have it, what kind of wars would it be used for anyway. And then this additional question where, you know, a fair number of people are saying, well, if that's what it takes in order to salvage the draft, we should expand it to women, which is wrong at many different levels for many different reasons. Most obviously because it won't work. Because we already know that, you know, the level of non-compliance made it impossible to get a working system for men. Why would anybody think that women are more willing to sign up to fight and kill and die than men were? There's a particular hypocrisy on the part of the people who say that, well, young women are strong enough to fight and, you know, willing enough to fight and aggressive enough to fill all military roles, but at the same time, manage to delude themselves into thinking that young women, these same battle-ready young women, are so disempowered, so weak, so submissive, that none of them will resist when they're ordered to come down and sign up and say, oh yeah, I'll kill whoever you want. So I think it's highly likely that the level of resistance from young women will be even greater than it's been.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a near certainty that, while people had different experiences, at every period in terms of how their families, their communities, those around them responded to draft resistance and the level of support they got. There's always been support, but it's varied, depending on the situation and the family and the community. I think it should go without saying that the level of family support and community support for women who refuse to fight and kill is going to be a whole lot greater than the support has been for male draft resistors. And it's not just going to be trying to go round up individual people, but you're going to be, they're going to be women who are standing there with their friends and family around them in solidarity, and you're basically going to have to, send armed raiding parties to make war on entire communities if you want to draft them. So, no plan or proposal for expanding draft registration to women should be taken seriously as other than naive and deluded fantasy, unless it includes a credible plan and budget. For how much of a police state you're going to have to create and how many dollars you're going to have to spend to identify, investigate, prosecute, and incarcerate all of the women who will resist and all of those who will stand with them.
Oh, it's completely untenable. I have a few comments we've received so far, so I'm going to read those. One of the comments, and this is from Jeff Patterson at Courage to Resist. He says, a surprisingly big assertion I'm seeing as we're starting to organize to end draft registration once and for all is, quote, the draft would be great because it'll make war less likely because the kids, the powerful, would be at risk. And if there is a war, more people would protest and stop it. I'll also add, I've heard this same line of conversations in progressive, peace-oriented folks. And so I'm curious, how do you respond to that?
First, I think it is indicative of an astonishingly profound and unexamined ageism. Because in saying you want to influence older people's behavior by threatening to kill their children, which is what you're saying, they would care if their kids were going to be drafted. It's not even hostage taking. You're literally, threatening to murder their children as a way to influence them. And what gives anybody the right to try to, influence people by inflicting pain and suffering and death on their children? So there's an underlying ageism to the draft in general. People will talk about a universal system. Well, they don't mean universal. They mean all young people. It's all about the attitude of older people that they think that somehow it's okay for us to vote, to send young people to do our bidding and to die on our behalf. Well, where does that come from? The second, and I think that should be sufficient that if people really think about what they're arguing for, they would reject that. But in terms of that argument that, if there were a draft, it would mobilize an anti-war movement. Well, sure, if the police are running riot in the streets, as they are often, well, if they were shooting more white people as well as more black people, maybe more white people would be out in the streets protesting police brutality. Does that mean we should argue, the police should start shooting more white people as well as all the black people they already shoot? This is what this argument amounts to. And I think it's just once you actually think about what they're saying, it's totally specious. Aside from that, it doesn't really hold up. We had a draft in Vietnam, and the draft did indeed, and resistance to the draft played a significant role, although primarily the Vietnamese won the war, which is why the war ended. When it ended was the Vietnamese won. Good for them. But the draft played a role, but it didn't succeed in stopping the war until tens of thousands of Americans and millions of Vietnamese that died. So it's not a particularly sterling model for, having a draft means we're going to have a successful anti-war movement.
One thing that's fascinating, this is sort of kind of related, sort of kind of not, but I've been a student for a long time and a fan of the draft resistance that happened in Oklahoma during World War I, particularly with the Green Corn Rebellion and that whole time period. And one of the things I've looked at beyond just those events of actual resistance to the draft through sometimes violent resistance even, one thing I've also looked at though is through genealogy research, looked at quite a few people's World War I draft registrations. And out of probably 20 or 30 I've looked at of male members of my family who were alive at that time period and some related families, I have only seen one person. And those as you could check whether you were militarily eligible or whether you were claiming an exemption right away at the registration stage. I've only found one out of 20 or 30 that said they were eligible. Everybody else had health issues, family hardship, you name it. And I just find this to be fascinating. And this is I mean, again, out of 20 or 30 I've looked at, I found only one that said, yeah, I'm ready, I can go. The rest didn't. And so I think sometimes I see as a way to, well, for lack of a better word, to subvert this system, and that is, it would be great to get rid of draft registration. But if we can't get rid of it, then we as the peace community, we need to use this as an organizing tool to raise the issue of conscience, certainly with the issue of the draft, but also in all the other ways that our lives intersect with the military industrial system. And so I feel like if we attack the system itself, but if we can't do that, then this is still a terrible opportunity, but an opportunity to ask all of us the question, what are we going to do to extricate ourselves from this system?
Well, I think, this is, one of the ways that the draft has always been, a catalyst for creating a movement. It's been, the draft played a central role in youth movements and anti-war movements, and it's partly because it forces people to make choices who might otherwise have ignored the whole thing. But I think partly your comments there, James, we need to recognize that we're playing a different game than we were a week ago.
Mm-hmm.
Draft registration is dead. There is not going to be draft registration unless Congress affirmatively acts. If Congress is stalemated, because registration of men is unconstitutional.
Yeah, you can't.
That's going to be appealed.
Requirement will be gone. You're right.
It's going to be appealed. It'll drag out for a year or two, but it's really, the legal case is open and shut. This is not a edge case legally. So they can appeal and stall it out for a year or two, but the current law is unconstitutional and it's going to be voided. Mm-hmm. So what we're left with is, unless Congress actually acts to enact a new law that includes women, draft registration is dead. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a good chance that Congress will be stalemated. And again, that's a good thing. I don't want to see women required to register. I don't want to see draft registration revived. The big issue, though, is, and why it's still important, is all of these lingering sanctions against all the millions of people who over the last almost 40 years have been faced with draft registration, many of whom have, for all the right reasons, or simply out of ignorance, not complied, and are going to face lifetime penalties unless Congress does some cleanup work. So my goal really is, draft registration of men is dead. I think that draft registration of women is not going to happen, because people, I think, are going to realize when they think about it that it's just not workable, and would require too much of a police state and too much money, and they're not prepared to make martyrs out of that many young women. But I think, the real challenge is going to be getting Congress to recognize, look, you need to clean this up, the mess that's been left by this 40 years of weirdness, with a program that wasn't being enforced, but people are still being punished for.
Now, would there be any options, you think, from the litigation standpoint eventually? I mean, I'm thinking that if the well, I don't know. That gets into interesting legal territory, because if the draft law registration was always unconstitutional, would there be any way of avoiding those previous convictions and those previous collateral actions through litigation? It would certainly be a lot easier if Congress would take action, but I don't. I could see it going either way.
it could go. I think the problem is the court has not ruled that registration was never constitutional. I mean, this was a district court that couldn't overrule the Supreme
Oh,
Court.
yeah.
And
You're
what
right.
it
The
said is
timing.
facts had changed. So people may not have registered at a time when draft registration was still constitutional.
Okay.
Probably changed its status because of changes in the facts, sometimes around 2015 or 2016. But it's the
Hmm.
facts on the ground change, not really that because of those changed facts, it became unconstitutional.
Okay.
This is why it's such a mess. I mean, I've been talking to the National Lawyers Guild, Military Law Task Force, and people are beginning to think about some of these questions. If Congress does nothing, there will be years, if not decades, of follow-up litigation, both at the federal level and with respect to these state laws, with probably inconsistent results in different places result because of either just different judges or nuances in how these different state laws are worded. So again, unless Congress does some cleanup work and maybe even state legislatures, and this is going to be a challenge for people to get them to act state by state, unless there's some legal cleanup work, we're going to face a mess, and people who didn't register are still going to face various barriers for a very long time.
Okay. Well, I have a few more questions and comments here. One comment I have from Serena in Oklahoma, she says, another dubious argument is that women will humanize the military, make it less violent somehow, but no details are ever offered. So, and then I have another, Rena also asked, and actually I think she's kind of the same questions I would have. She's asking, why does Ed think Congress won't pass a new draft law? Do I understand him to say it's basically because the women are included and people aren't ready for that?
Yeah, I mean, to be constitutional, a new law or an amendment to the law to try to restore its constitutionality would definitely have to include women. Whether or not politically they're willing to do that, I think is up in the air. The unfortunate thing is that while there's a long tradition of radical anti-war feminism, you know, Alice Paul, who wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, was a Quaker, a pacifist opposed to war and conscription. But there are a lot of liberals today who, rather than seeing this historic feminist argument against war and seeing war as, you know, one of the things that men do that's wrong with us, as men, there are those, you know, from sort of a liberal position who are arguing for drafting women in the name of women's equality. I think it's misguided. There's obviously an argument about what feminism means. It's not for me to argue what feminism means, but there are people who are willing to do it. I think the reason it will fail is because and if we can bring into the debate realism. I'm not trying to persuade people in Congress not to want a draft. I'm trying to persuade them that, like it or not, draft registration of men has failed. Like it or not, an attempt to register women for the draft will fail. Like it or not, an attempt to enforce draft registration against women will create a civil war.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it sounds like to me, and this is my read of it, is that really the issues legally and ethically and everything else, but especially legally, of draft registration and the possibility of a draft in the future, those two issues to me sound like they're kind of decoupled. I mean, I can certainly see from the idea that registration fuels the draft, but since Congress could through either new legislation or, I mean, I could see various ways that they could even put registration on ice and yet retain infrastructure to keep a draft, to be able to activate it if necessary. And again, my theory is they would just use commercial databases if they don't want the political cost of registration. And so given that, is from my perspective, that means that whether there's draft registration or not, anyone who's at risk of being drafted still needs to be prepared for various contingencies, would be my thinking. But am I thinking right about that? What would your response to that be?
Well, I mean, one of the things that this National Commission has been charged with exploring is whether there should be some alternative. And partly, you know, the reason for Congress to appoint a committee was to try to give them political cover. So if the commission comes back and recommends, you know, because they don't see any real choice, ending the current registration scheme, they may still recommend some other system, which could, as you say, be based on commercial databases, on other sources of information. Getting the databases, though, that's only getting to the first step. That gets them an address where they think somebody who might be the right age, who they might want to draft, lives, that they can try to send out an induction notice. Sending out an induction notice doesn't mean delivering a warm body, into uniform if the person doesn't voluntarily show up. Bottom line is, if people don't willingly submit, they still have to have enough people to go out and knock on doors and either dragoon these people onto the bus to the induction center or, drag them off to a federal prison. And what kind of infrastructure does that require? And the more we can focus the debate on that, the more chance they'll have to realize that, okay, just substituting commercial databases for, a database that's mostly generated from driver's licenses doesn't really change the fundamentals of the fact that, to get back to what I said earlier, the ability of the government to wage war, like it or not, depends on whether people are willing to fight it. And the good news is that people today, young people today as well as old people, but people today in general, are a lot more skeptical about the government than they were back even during the Vietnam War. I mean, I think it's a change that Vietnam brought about. It's a change perhaps even more that Watergate brought about. And that's why even by 1980, there'd been a sea change in the level of resistance. And why today, I think, people are much less willing to say, oh, okay, the government says there are these people over there we ought to kill. Okay, I guess there must be some reason we're supposed to kill them. We've seen too many wrong-headed wars. And let me just give you one, colossal example of that. When Jimmy Carter proposed bringing back draft registration in 1980, and this is when I was supposed to register, the reason for registration was in order to respond to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So it was in case we needed to send massive numbers of American ground troops to Afghanistan to fight on which side? Wait a minute, which side were we on? This was when we were supporting the people who were opposing the Soviet invasion. That is to say, the people who were then called the Mujahideen and who would later come to call themselves the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I went to prison for refusing to sign a piece of paper agreeing that on demand I'd go fight on the side of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Now, what does that say about the government's ability, even if it picks the right wars, to pick which side we should be fighting on? And after a long succession of, fighting on the wrong side in Vietnam, fighting on the wrong side in a succession of other wars, why should we be signing that over to the government? And how willing do they really think people are to have that kind of unquestioning obedience today?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to mention real quick, a few things. One is, of course, if anyone has questions or comments, we have a little bit of time, so please post them. I'll check back on the comments in just a moment. Do want to mention, though, also in response to what we're talking about tonight, we have a couple of ways of the Objector Church that we are seeking to spark some action, and these are things that anybody can do. And so, what I'd suggest, if you want to do this, write down these web addresses, because actually everything is at objector.church. And on that page, there are two links I want to point folks to. The first one is our Objector Registry, which is a project where we're encouraging people, particularly though anyone who could be drafted, to complete our registry, to provide some documentation of evidence of where your beliefs were at this point in time, just in the event of a future draft. But we also have a petition that we are calling for an end to draft registration itself. And let me see if I can find that link. I'm not seeing it, but Jeff, Arena, if you could post it on the Facebook, that would be fantastic. But anyway, I want to mention these as some practical things as far as our own personal responses to the issue of the draft and conscription. So let me check and see if we have any more questions. Ed, are there any other things you'd like to share that we haven't talked about tonight?
I think the main thing is for people to be aware of this is happening, aware that, that this does not mean that women have to be drafted. It does not mean that the only, way to respond to this court decision is, oh, women have to be drafted. No, nobody should be drafted. And it's important because this is going to be in Congress in all likelihood within the next year or two after probably the court appeals play out. It's important to start spreading awareness now and start pushing people in Congress now that they should repeal draft registration, repeal all of these penalties for people who have not registered, who did the right thing over the last 40 years. And particularly for feminists, for women, for young women, most of all, let them know two things. One, that drafting women is not a feminist initiative. It's not in women's interest. It's not in anybody's interest. It does not reflect feminist values. War is not a good thing. And secondly, let them know that if there is an attempt to require women to register for the draft or to subject them to some new kind of draft, you will resist if you're a young woman who's subject to that, and you will support young women who resist if you're a man or you're older. Because again, I don't think we're going to persuade the Pentagon. We're not going to persuade too many people in Congress. They have their views about war. So I think it's a pragmatic question, not what do you want in your fantasy land. If you had some magic wand that you could wave and, threw pixie dust on people and they'd pick up a gun, but are you prepared as a member of Congress to actually face what it will take in the face of the likely resistance to try to draft women?
Absolutely. Well, we often have quite a few viewers later on in a recorded version of this. So if folks have questions, where would be a good place for them? You want to share your website or other point of contact?
I have a website with a lot of information about both this specific issue of women and the draft, as well as the current draft registration program and what people can do. That's at resistors with an s.info. Again, it's resistors.info. And there's also a background there about this National Commission, which is studying the question, and the hearings coming up, which are April 24th and 25th for any of you in DC. I think that'll be a very interesting opportunity to be heard directly. It's not often that you have, a National Commission that's literally setting up an open mic that people can walk up and tell them what they think. That's going to be going on for 2 days at Gallaudet University in DC on April 24th and 25th. The other place for information about this, as I'm sure you know, is couragetoresist.org. And they, I know, have the petition up on, I think, on their homepage at the moment. So resistors.info for information about the draft, and for a broader range of ideas about both resistance to the draft and resistance by those currently in the military, couragetoresist.org.
Well, the last thing for our conversation, Ed, I want to mention that I think one of the issues I'm seeing is because it's been off a lot of people's radar screens for so long, that a lot of even peace organizations, peace churches and whatnot, they're not giving out good advice, or they don't have good information right now. So I want to mention here in Oklahoma City, I'm hoping in the next few weeks to be putting together some kind of event where these different communities can get together, find out how things are changing, and what we should do in the meantime as far as the organizing efforts and other things that's happening. So for some of you in the local peace community, you can expect me to be emailing, calling very soon. But in the meantime, if you want to reach out to me, particularly if you're outside of Oklahoma City, my email is james@objector.church. And I'm certainly willing to travel if the distance isn't too far. We have a lot of folks that could speak on this topic, but really think it's time to raise the issue in a much bigger way. And again, it's not just for the sake of the particular legal issues right now, but it's to spark hopefully broader conversations about the nature of war itself. Anyway, that's beyond this, Ed, I have a few more announcements, but you don't have to stay for this. You're welcome to, but I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's really an honor to speak to you. I was actually really meaningful to me because when I was moving away from a very pro-war, very conservative Christian fundamentalist perspective, as I was starting to question more and more, I think one of the first websites I looked up on the issue of the draft and whatnot was, I think, one of your websites. And this would have been way back there. Late 90s, early 2000s, thereabouts. But anyway, I just have really, at the time, it was an encouraging thing to read your story of resistance and to just get some good information on where things stand. So it's an honor to get to meet you, and hopefully we'll have you on again as things update.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for your work to call attention to this issue and to try to help people out who are realizing that they actually have choices to make. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, our last few announcements, I want to mention that for any of you who are regular attenders of our webcast, the Objector Church, we now have fleshed out our membership program of what it means to be a member of the Objector Church. And we have a full membership available, particularly for people in our local communities who want to have more of an inclusive kind of thing. But our associate memberships are there for people that mostly connect to us online but want to support what we're doing. So you can find out more about this at objector.church. Look for the membership link. And again, if you have questions, I would love to talk to you about it. My email is james@objector.church. And I'll mention one very practical thing is for a lot of folks, we're envisioning this that maybe people from other traditions, religious traditions, who their tradition they've grown up with isn't peace-oriented, but they want to show in some way where they stand. This is a chance to do that for people that may not be religious at all, but are wanting to support and connect with what we're doing. There's a lot of ways to get involved. I also want to mention that we have a new podcast that we're sponsoring. Serena, one of the ministers of the Objector Church, has put this together, and it comes out every other week dealing with issues of peace and social justice. Her website is at peacebuzz.net, and her podcast, it is fantastic, very well done, about 30 minutes in most episodes. Give you an idea, the last one she had, and actually, I haven't got to hear this one yet, so I'm excited, the new one. But the new one, it says, this episode packed with news reports in the field, including Guantanamo, Meta Peace Team at the southern border, Venezuela, and events from Amnesty USA, World Beyond War, and Veterans for Peace. Peace People segment features Angela Davis. So check it out. It's at peacebuzz.net. And other than that, be sure and join us next week about the same time. We do our webcast live Sunday night, 7 p.m. Central Time, 5 p.m. Pacific. All of our program is, of course, available on our website. Usually on the website, be a day or two later, just depending on how long it takes to edit it up and make it sound a little better. But in the meantime, it's already available on Facebook. You can watch it there. And lastly, if you have comments, if you're watching it on Facebook, post your comments there. I'll check those periodically or shoot me an email. So thank you so much for tuning in. And again, thanks to Ed for joining us, and we'll see you soon.